Sari Beth Rosenberg is in her 21st year teaching at in a public school in New York City, School for Environmental Studies. It is a joy and a privilege to have a teacher host this show. We wouldn't do it any other way, I'm glad to say. And Sari, why don't you take it away?
It's so exciting to see so many people here, so many people here on a Thursday night, many of whom taught all day or worked all day. And I also just wanted to thank, before I get started, Vicki, PBS NewsHour Classroom, everyone who's provided us this space. Let's give them a round of applause. This is our third season. We've been doing these since the heart of the pandemic. And it just gives me, I've met so many people in these Zooms. We've connected over so many topics and so many concerns and so many joys as well. And I'm just so thankful to PBS for giving us this amazing, safe space to have the conversations that we really need to be having right now. And I know why you're here. It's because we have the honor, the amazing honor of having Diane Ravitch with us. And I was of course fangirling a bit when she joined the Zoom earlier, and I'm sure you all are as well. So I of course could go on and on with Diane's biography, but I just want to, for those of you who are not aware of her background, just going to briefly introduce her and then get into this conversation that we're all dying to have with her tonight. And just so you all know, if you haven't been joining these Zooms before and you're a first timer, the way they work is Diane is obviously your very special guest. We also have Josh here tonight who's going to jump in and talk to us about what's going on in his state of Michigan, but you're also all the guests. So as Vicki said, please also share questions that you have as they come up. And we might not be able to get to all of them because we have so many here tonight, but we will try to get to some of your questions and points. So please feel free to put them in the chat and maybe even double up so we see them. And also just, I ask that you all mute immediately so our amazing conversation with Diane doesn't get interrupted at all. So Diane Ravitch is the founder and president of the Network for Public Education, also a research professor of education at New York University and a historian of education. All of you probably know that from 1991 to 1993, she was Assistant Secretary of Education in the administration for George H.W. Bush. Her new book, which I highly recommend, is called Slaying Goliath: The Passionate Resistance to Privatization and the Fight to Save America's Public Schools. And some lucky people tonight might get this delivered to them if they win the raffle. The rest of you, please purchase it. It's worth it. In this book, she details the work of parents, advocates, teachers, and others in opposing efforts by the federal government and private interests to remake public education through high stakes testing, charter schools, and other initiatives. So I could go on and on, but I'm just going to edit myself down and just start with my first question. So first of all, Diane, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As you can see, we have a packed Zoom room with so many people thrilled to hear from you. So I'm just going to get into my first question, and I'm going to get into it right away. Let's start talking about privatization. Let's just go there immediately. You ready? So sure. in your book, Reign of Error, you subtitled this book that came out in 2014, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement and the Danger to America's Public Schools. And I just want to note that you were using the word hoax back in 2014, long before someone else was, and many of us as well. So when we talk about privatization in public schools in America, what do we mean? And who are the people behind this
PBS.
hoax? I'm just going to ask that one more time. Let's mute as we join. My question is, when we talk about privatization, what do we mean? And who are the people behind the hoax?
Okay, good question. But before I answer the question, I have to just say a word about how I got to this point in my own life. I was for many years an advocate of high stakes testing, of teacher evaluation by test scores, of the importance of testing. And then when the charter idea came along in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I thought it was a great thing and we should try charter schools. It sounded like a really good idea. And I was in favor of it. And I was on board. I was actually a member of a number of very conservative think tanks at that time at the Hoover Institution and other places, but Hoover is particularly prominent. And after the passage of No Child Left Behind, which I supported, around 2006, I went to a conference and the question was, is No Child Left Behind working? And everybody who gave a paper was someone who was on the side of No Child Left Behind and said, it's not working here, it's not working here, it's not working here. And I concluded, well, it's not working. And I began looking at, because I was at Hoover, where everyone that I was associated with was a very strong proponent of charter schools, and some were very strong proponents of vouchers. John Chubb and Terry Moe, who wrote a very important book around 1990, advocating for vouchers, were part of the group that I was involved in at Hoover. And I began to dissent from a lot of the ideas because in the quiet of our meeting room at Hoover, which is a fabulously wealthy place, people were saying to each other, the charter schools are not working. So many of them are closing, and so many of them there have been problems with people stealing money, and the lack of accountability is a problem. What are we going to do? And so, but no one wanted to say publicly, it's not working. And I began to be, as I saw what testing was turning into under No Child Left Behind, that it was squeezing the joy of learning out of the classroom, and that children were now spending more and more time preparing to take the test instead of spending time on science and experiments and history and doing things that are fun in school, reading books that are fun to read. They were doing test prep and more test prep, and everything was being judged by test scores. So about, I'd say late 2006, 2007, I began to rethink everything that I had believed all my professional life. And in 2010, I wrote a book that I consider to be my most important book. It's called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. And in that book, I totally recanted everything that I had written for the previous 30 years. And it was a big sensation. And a lot of people would say, well, why did you change your mind? And I said, well, you could read the book and you'd find out. I was wrong. And I've looked at the evidence and I realized that charter schools were not better than public schools. Many of them were worse. There were just enormous numbers of charter school scandals, and they've only gotten worse since then. And testing is ruining education. I mean, education is more than testing, so I became very critical of testing, very critical of standardized testing, of high stakes testing, of judging teachers by test scores. And the more I learned after my change of heart and mind and soul, the more I became convinced that we were on the wrong path, that the No Child Left Behind was a disaster. A race to the top was a bigger disaster. The Common Core was a disaster because Common Core assumes that if everybody studies the same thing at the same time, they'll all come out exactly the same. And children are not widgets. Every one of them is different. And you can't, even in the same classroom with the same teacher and the same curriculum, kids will still come out different. So I had a major change of heart. The reason that I helped to create and was a co-founder of the Network for Public Education is to fight against high stakes testing, to try to persuade the people in Washington that it's not working, and to fight against privatization. And I consider both charters and vouchers to be a form of privatization. And I'm well aware of some very, very fine charters. I visited one in Massachusetts recently, and I was blown away by what a terrific school it was. But I'm more taken by the fact that there have been so many terrible charter scandals where we have charter chains popping up across the country that are like the Walmarts of American education. And they say, well, you know, your community doesn't need a local school board. Your community just needs a privately run charter school. And the charter schools generally have very little accountability. And consequently, there have been major scandals involving millions and millions of dollars where the principal of the school or the someone on the board gave themselves contracts or embezzled millions of dollars. The biggest single charter, well, the two biggest charter scandals. Number one was in California with an online company. The online companies are really problematic, and it was called A3. And the A3 company was running summer programs and paying people to sign up kids who never attended. They scammed the state of California of at least $80 million, although some think it might be as much as $200 million. There was no education going on. It was simply a money-making affair. In Ohio, had a charter chain called ECOT, the Electronic Classroom of the Future. No, the Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow. And in ECOT, that company collected over $1 billion between around 2000 and 2019. It eventually went bankrupt when the state did an audit and concluded that they had a lot of phantom students. They had the lowest graduation rate of any school in the nation. I think their graduation rate was 20%. And it was a gigantic scam. The guy who owned ECOT, who was some kind of a salesman, had a lot of other companies providing services that he was paying, and, you know, getting vast amounts of money, collecting $1 billion and providing a very poor education, largely to students who were clicking on and clicking off. Any big scandals in the online area. The second big scandal was in Connecticut. And I just the other day on my blog called it the biggest charter scandal in all history. And that is that there was a school there, a charter chain called Fuse, and I can't remember what the acronym was, but Fuse ran a school called Jamoke, and Jamoke was run by a man who said he was Dr. Michael Sharp. And at some point, as he continued to expand and was planning to expand into Baton Rouge and to take over more schools in Hartford, questions were raised about whether he actually had a degree and whether he was Dr. Michael Sharp. And it turned out he didn't have a degree. And then it turned out as there was somebody did a little more digging. And this is a company that had collected millions of dollars from the state of Connecticut. He had served time in prison. He was a convicted felon, and he was hiring other ex-felons to work in his schools. And the reason I say it's the biggest charter scandal of all time was that he resigned in, I think it was 2014 or 2015, but just a week ago, he was convicted on DNA evidence of having raped 4 women in their homes and held guns to their head. And this is a man, that was years before he became one of the biggest charter leaders in Connecticut. And he was celebrated by the Center for Education Reform, which is the main charter organization in the country. Anyway, I'm going on too long. My point is, you asked what's privatization? Privatization is when you turn public money over to non-public, non-state actors, to private boards that are not elected and that are not accountable to anyone, and to religious schools and to private schools. That's privatization. Right. The other question is, why did I say that it was the hoax in 2014?
What's behind? So, I mean, I think you've already shared a couple anecdotes about some of the people who are behind the hoax.
Well,
right.
You know, what's made this a hoax is that there was the promise that, first of all, you had to create a crisis. And the crisis was public schools are failing. How many times did we hear that? I probably wrote that myself on many occasions. But they were not failing. They were dealing with a lot of problems. They get all the social problems of the society, of kids who have either, you know, they don't speak English, they're impoverished, they're hungry, all kinds of issues that they bring from their home. And those problems end up in the public schools. And that's not a reason to say that the schools are failing. It's a reason to say they need more help. They need more resources. They need more attention. And the hoax was, first of all, that public schools are failing and that private schools are giving money over to private organizations will save the children. That was a hoax because from the beginning, and I knew this from my experience at Hoover and also at the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank in Manhattan, we knew this wasn't true. And yet this continued to be sold as a hoax that it would save children. Now, when you find out that 75% of the kids getting vouchers are already enrolled in private school, that means it's a hoax too. No one's being saved.
So I'm just going to ask you a really plain and simple question. I have a bunch of other questions lined up, but what is the solution then, right? Because clearly we need to now reform the reformers, right? The reform movement needs its own reforming. And of course, there's studies that say that some people say spending per child and class size makes a difference. There's other studies that say it doesn't even affect academic achievement. There's so many variables, obviously, that go into improving public schools. I don't like to have people I don't like us going back in time, but moving forward, based on, and I have to say, a lot of people in the chat are saying this, so it's so powerful to have someone like yourself say you were wrong. And I think, and not necessarily wrong, but look, based on what was happening with your policies, shifting gears. And I know that's difficult to do. And I just wish more public figures, especially in the education world, would do that, because I think it's coming from because your main goal here is to create the best education system for young people. And I think that many reformers and policymakers start losing sight of that. So all that being said, where do we go from here? What would be your ideal situation to fix it now?
Well, what I did in Reign of Error was to answer the reformers' objections. And this was because I was being profiled by David Denby of the New Yorker. And he said, well, I've talked to all these people in the reform movement, and they say, you just have complaints and criticisms. What are your solutions? And so I think I have, I don't know, it's 15, 16, 7. I do a kind of life cycle thing where I talk about number one, if we wanted to fix American education, we have to look beyond education. And number one, the United States has one of the highest rates of infant mortality, of maternal ill health and infant mortality. I think that our infant mortality rate or the lack of prenatal care is somewhere on the list. It's a World Health Organization list tied with someplace like Somalia. I mean, it is shocking. If somebody wants to quote test scores at me, what I used to do was to say, yeah, but we're 140th in the world in infant mortality. I mean, don't you think that's more important than our math test scores? And then you go on from saying, what if we made sure that every woman who's pregnant has medical care and that babies were born healthy? It would reduce the number of children who have developmental disabilities. It would lower the infant mortality rate, but it would particularly make sure that children come to school healthy, which is a promise made long ago during the Bush administration and was not acted upon because it cost money. And frankly, the Republicans didn't want any programs that cost money. But it does cost money to make sure that every woman has medical care. So that's number one. Number two is, what about the period from birth to age 3 before kids get into preschool? And I found some programs that were very successful where nurses and nurse practitioners went to parents' homes and taught them how to be better mothers, taught them what their children needed, how to help take care of them, how to make sure that they weren't exposed to smoke in the home or to other things that might affect their development. And then, of course, we need better early childhood education. And largely the people who work in Head Start are paid about half of what regular teachers are paid. And many of them are the mothers of Head Start children. And I discovered that the Head Start program had been turned into an anti-poverty program. And so mothers were being given jobs, which mothers should have jobs. But if we really want the 3 to 5 period to be a good one, there should be accredited teachers there. And so that was part of it. And then as I went through the list, one of the things I added is that class size makes a difference. If a teacher has 32 children, it's going to be a lot harder for her than if she has 24 children or 22 children or 20 children. And this is why New York State just recently passed legislation reducing class size in the future. Florida has had class size reduction, which I'm sure has benefited the kids in Florida. And that was passed by popular vote. Class size does make a difference. Kids act out less. They get more individual attention. The teachers are able to spend more time with individual children. And any teacher that I've ever met, if you ask them, what's the one thing that would make you a better teacher, they would say, having fewer kids in the class. And there is a huge difference between, say, 20 and 32 in terms of outcomes. But those would be big things. And I would, I looked at other things having to do with making sure that children during their lifetime as children have access to medical care. Because a lot of the reasons that kids are doing poorly in school is that they're sick. They miss days because they're sick. They don't see a doctor. They don't see a dentist. They don't see an eye doctor. If all kids were guaranteed that kind of medical care that middle class parents expect to be typical for their own children, then we would have much better outcomes in school. So these are all things that I've specific and very positive answers that I've given. And, the bottom line is that if you look at test scores, if you look at the outcomes of test scores, which I've done for the SAT, the ACT, the international test, the state test, the national test, which is called NAEP, they all show that the outcomes are tightly correlated with family income and family education to some extent, but mostly family income. And the poorest kids have the lowest scores, and the richest kids have the highest scores. And there's no deviation. It's like a step ladder from the poorest to the most affluent. So you have to, I think, the conclusion I draw is that if we didn't have so much poverty in this country, there'd be better outcomes in education. And then people say, well, we can't cure poverty, but we did briefly in the early part of the Biden administration have a child tax credit program that reduced child poverty by some dramatic number. It was like 40 or 50%. And Congress let it expire. The Democrats, I think it was Joe Manchin was the one vote, as usual, who let it expire. Yes. If you could reduce child poverty by a huge percentage, why wouldn't you continue to do it? That helps children. That helps teachers.
Yes. Absolutely. And tacking on to the healthcare, mental health care as well. That's something that I'm sure every teacher here, sees the need for that in the student population, even before the pandemic, but now more than ever. But
yes, I think we're seeing a tremendous amount of acting out. When people talk about crime, most of what they're talking about is people who've just gone nuts because they have not had socialization skills for the last 2 years. They've been isolated. They don't have a job, or they can't hold a job because of their mental issues. We have a lot of problems, and the problems are not the fault of the schools. The problems are stemming from our neglect of addressing them.
Yeah, they're systemic wide. So there's so many amazing points in the chat. So I want to open up the conversation to everyone, but I have one more question for you, talking about, how society's ills seem to always be put on the shoulders of teachers. And which brings me to I would love you to put contextualize what a lot of the teachers on the ground right now are experiencing in many states across the country, which are all these teaching bans called anti-CRT laws. I call them anti-history laws, book bans. Would love to get some historical context from you about these bans. In what ways are they similar to what we've seen throughout the history of American education? And in what ways are they different today? Would love to hear that from you. And then I would love to open up the conversation to, I'm going to bring in Josh and then some other folks who have some great points in here.
Well, looking back historically, I wrote a book earlier called The Language Police, and it was about efforts to censorship textbooks and also tests. And that goes on all the time. I have at the back of the book, a list of about 800 words and phrases and images that are not allowed to be shown on tests. And it's words like yacht, because maybe a poor kid has never seen a yacht, but then it becomes words having to do with gender, where you can't refer to a cowboy, for example. That's a banned word, or cowgirl is a banned word. An old person can't be shown with crutches or a cane, but it would be good if you have an old person up on the roof nailing in shingles. It's really, you don't know whether to laugh or cry, but this has been going on. And in the book, I talk about the history of censorship and how even Shakespeare, the term is bowdlerized. Even his works have been bowdlerized by people who thought that he used too many sexy words. So there has been in the past an effort to remove anything that was remotely erotic, and believe me, it was very remote. And book censorship has gone on for a long time, but it waxes and wanes. Right now, we're going through a waxing period. The CRT bans and the censorship and the book banning are all interrelated, and they too are a tremendous hoax. First of all, CRT as such is not taught in any school. I know what CRT is. I knew that one of the founders of CRT was a very good friend of mine, Derek Bell, who was a professor of law at Harvard and then at NYU. And he was a very kind and thoughtful man who had worked for the NAACP for many years. And he was frustrated that the victory of the Brown decision had not brought about the changes that he hoped for. And so he began to say, there must be something embedded in our legal system and in our policies, our practices, that's racist, that doesn't allow us to move beyond the legal victories. And so he began looking critically at why was racism persisting? He was not a Marxist. He was not a radical. He was not a fanatic. He was not a socialist. He was not a communist. He was a very decent, brilliant man. I understand critical race theory, and I think that when you talk about racism, there are politicians who say that's critical race theory because you're teaching about racism. So they don't want you to teach about slavery, except in the most, mildest of terms. You can't teach honestly about the Ku Klux Klan. You can't talk about the mobs that prevented desegregation. I mean, one of the reasons that all of it, I tie this together with privatization, because part of what is behind privatization is an effort to resegregate the schools. And privatization in other countries has led to resegregation. And we have many schools that were private schools that became charter schools, and they're all white. There are many charter schools that are all Black. So, and voucher is the same thing. You get a lot more segregation. This has been proven in 2 countries that have outright privatization, Chile and Sweden, where there was economic segregation, racial segregation, religious segregation. And CRT is a hoax. Most legislators who pass these laws, if you ask them to define it, they can't define it. They have no idea what it is. What they really mean is don't teach about racism. Don't teach that white people enslaved Black people and treated them very badly. And don't teach about the Tulsa massacre. I mean, I learn all the time about things that I was never taught in school, because I learned from the old history books and the old high school textbooks were at the time I was going to school, were actually sympathetic to the South. And they talked about, what I was taught about Reconstruction was that these carpetbaggers came from the North, and these uppity blacks became senators and governors, and they were ignorant and they didn't know what they were doing. Well, none of that was true. Reconstruction was an incredible era. And I would say that the best resource for that is the 4-part series that Henry Louis Gates did for PBS about Reconstruction, where he showed Black senators and Black governors and Black congressmen who were incredibly, I don't know how they became so well educated, but they were very smart and they were doing good things. And a book that I would recommend about this history is Schoolhouse Burning by Derek Black. Derek Black is a professor at the University of South Carolina, and he gives the history of education as a lawyer, which he is. And he says that the best laws about education, requiring public education in every state, were written during Reconstruction. And they were written by integrated legislatures throughout the South. And in some states like South Carolina and Louisiana, they abolished segregated schooling. Well, as soon as Reconstruction was over, segregation returned. But at least, the whites didn't want to get rid of those laws because so many whites didn't have access to public education in the South. It was because of Reconstruction and Black leadership during Reconstruction that they were able to have a right to public education. And so we have this long history of public education is a road to freedom. It's a road to freeing yourself from your parents' prejudices. What these anti-CRT crusaders are doing is to say, you should have the same prejudices that I have. I'm stupid and you should be stupid. And you must not teach history accurately, because if you do that, it might make some people uncomfortable, meaning themselves.
Yeah, and thank you. And I will say something we talk a lot about in these conversations is it's also a means to uphold white supremacy. I'm just going to call it out. And it's also a means to erase the story of so many teachers and even and students in the classroom. It's erasing their contributions, their ancestors' contributions to the story of America. And it's very troubling and sad for me that my fellow teachers across this country can't teach the topics that are so crucial to build empathetic citizens in this country. So I just hope, like you say, it waxes and wands, and I really hope we get to the other side of it in the wanting stage. So let's open up the conversation. I want to bring in Josh. He's here with some promising news from his home state. And then please start throwing we have Joe's going to go next because he has had his hand raised for like 3 hours now. And then we'll open up the conversation. So raise hands, but I'm going to toss this to Josh right now.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everybody. And I will be very quick because I know there are lots of questions and I want to hear what Diane has to say about them too. But just speaking of this kind of ebb and flow of trends forward and backward in this public ed movement. I'm here from Michigan, and we had some really good news this week from the election, and it was news that we didn't necessarily anticipate. And I've had sort of my own kind of I was wrong set of moments, and I won't go into those right now, but I can stick a couple of columns in the chat about that. But I've been watching this for quite a while, and I've been studying vouchers for 17 years. So this was kind of ground zero, this election cycle. And as everybody I think on this meeting knows, Betsy DeVos is from here. This is Betsy DeVos's home turf, and we're kind of one of her original staging grounds. You care a lot about where you grew up when you care about things that you're going to go out into the world and work on. So we had a resounding defeat for Betsy DeVos and DeVosism here in Michigan. And there's really no other way to put it. I mean, first and foremost, this was an embrace of reproductive rights. The election results. We had a constitutional amendment for reproductive rights on the ballot, but The second sort of most important piece of this was we had a real rejection of DeVosism. We had a candidate named Tudor Dixon who really was the handpicked, literally handpicked candidate of Betsy DeVos, sort of the avatar, I like to say, of DeVosism. Everything that we just talked about, privatization, CRT, book banning, anti-LGBTQ plus, Dixon embraced all of these things and did so sort of with direct coordination with DeVos. DeVos even wrote, right now the National Republican Party is trying to kind of say all this is just Trump's fault and everybody really likes everything we have to say, but they hate Trump. That's actually, Trump really wasn't that involved in our election here. Betsy DeVos had to have a handwritten note that was leaked to the New York Times in August, begging Trump to endorse Dixon. So not only did Dixon lose, and not only did DeVos herself prop the Dixon campaign up with $6 million of her own money, but our governor Gretchen Whitmer is a strong supporter, had a generational budget achievement sort of in favor of public schools this summer. Not only was Whitmer reelected and our Secretary of State and our Attorney General, but just as importantly, all 8 statewide education candidates that were strong defenders of public ed were elected or reelected. And our state legislature flipped from Republican to Democrat for the first time since 1983. Before 1983, the last time we had a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature was 1937. Before that, 1933, and before that, 1891. This has not happened much in the state of Michigan, and this was an explicit rejection of DeVos. It's really difficult to explain. I'm going to be trying to do this over the next few weeks in different sort of media outlets, but even in DeVos's hometown, which is a very conservative place in Western Michigan called Ada Township, Gretchen Whitmer won 51-48. Now that sounds close, only 3 points. But consider that Whitmer herself lost 43-55% against the Republican opponent in the same township in 2018, and that was not an explicit DeVos election. So you put DeVosism on the ballot in DeVos's hometown, Gretchen Whitmer won. And it was absolutely an emphatic defense of public education. So it's really hard. I hope you can hear the enthusiasm in my voice, because I have been working, not as long as Diane has, but I've been working on this voucher issue for a long time. It's hard to be encouraged. And this week it's really encouraging, at least here, at least in one spot. Doesn't mean we're not going to keep trying to fight for this stuff in other states. Already out there with our friends in Texas and Oklahoma trying to work against their voucher plans. But in Michigan, we had some good news. And I do think if you're a data-oriented person, as I am, we have some real data points, at least this week, that this is not even popular stuff. This isn't just the 58 of us on the call talking about this. These are voters out there rejecting this stuff wholesale. So I'll stop there, but that's what I wanted to say.
And welcome news, because we've often had a lot of bad news these days in the world of public education. And I wrote in the chat, we need to review the Michigan playbook so that we can replicate it elsewhere. So, and I know Josh, you're on that. So let's keep this conversation going, and we'll keep talking. But thank you so much for jumping on here. To be continued.
Absolutely.
So Joe, let's go. Joe, C. Brian, I think it's Brian, and then Melissa. So Joe.
Hey, my name is Joe. I'm a high school teacher in Portland, Oregon. And my question to Diane and the audience is really kind of what actionable items can we do? I love talking about the problems. Diane's books, document them. Herb Cole, who I studied under to get my credential, wrote a lot of books documenting the problems in public schools. But I'm more concerned about like kind of action. And when I taught in San Francisco, we did like crazy things, like we begged as teachers in the median for school supplies. And we got Mark Sanchez elected to school board. And then my life kind of slowed down because I had a kid. And now that she's older, I'm back to kind of more time. My union is looking for strong school board candidates, but really I feel like we are just bailing out a sinking ship with a Dixie cup, and there's enough messages. The victims keep getting changed. Like the right wing, they go after LGBTQ kids, then they go after the books, then they just keep changing their targets because it makes I call it hate activation. It activates all the MAGA people. Like it's called angertainment. and someone, election news is good here in Portland, but someone just ran for city council who has no experience. They're like a soccer dad, and he ran on anger, and he's an absolute Republican candidate who was voted overwhelmingly in a progressive city. He just fooled everyone thinking he's progressive. And as teachers, our union is just barely, it's a Dixie cup bailing out boats. So my question is to Diane, especially two specific questions on the childcare. You mentioned how the US, we have horrible, education statistics, but we have horrible statistics for caring pregnant mothers. And then we have horrible statistics for getting kids through their first, second, and third year preschool. Kind of to Diane and everyone, like, what's going on for action as a countermeasure? That's my question. Sorry it took so long.
Okay, if I could just give you a brief answer. The action has to be political, because you've got to win elections and get people who are supporters of public education and who understand public schools are not failing. I didn't quote any horrible statistics. In fact, if you read my book, Reign of Error, which I hope you will, the NAEP scores, when I wrote that book, which was in 2013, were the highest that ever been in American history. So rather than failing schools, we had schools that were getting better and better and better. And a public narrative from people like Bill Gates saying that they were horrible. So you have all these, the problem has been that the other side, the ones who want to privatize and destroy public education, have a lot of billionaires. Betsy DeVos is only one. In my book, The Slaying Goliath, I have a chapter just listing the names. It's unbelievable of these incredibly wealthy people who either didn't go to public schools or think that no one should go to public schools, who are willing to put millions and millions. And one of the stories I told on my blog the other day was in Indiana. Reed Hastings from California, who's the CEO of Netflix, calls himself a liberal Democrat, but he loves charter schools. He's put $100 million at least into charter schools, probably much more than that. He also funded the most conservative Republicans in the Indiana election. And he and Michael Bloomberg, another alleged liberal, were responsible for electing the most conservative members of the Indiana legislature, who then passed one of the nation's worst abortion bans and also eliminated gun control. So here you have alleged liberal Democrats funding abortion bans and eliminating gun control because they want to fund charters. It's crazy. And Bill Gates sees there's just no end to his enthusiasm. And no matter what statistics you show them, data doesn't matter. They just have a feeling that they're right, and they're so damn rich that they think they're smart. But one example of what you can do is in Ohio, the Ohio Federation of Teachers and the Ohio Education Association got together and recruited 3 candidates for the State Board of Education. And they were all very strong supporters of public schools, and the 3 of them were elected. And I say, wow, that's fantastic, because that means, if the billionaires can go in and go to another state that, that they've never even visited and spend $10 million on a candidate, why don't the local unions get together and find candidates and run them for the state school board and the local school boards? That's where the power is, and the legislature.
That's a great idea. Let's definitely promote that when we release this recording. That's such a great idea. We need to share that if we're in unions, we really need to share that idea.
Yeah, Sarah Beth, I want to add also that part of the attack on public education has been to attack unions. And we've seen this dramatic decline in union membership. And the most certain route from poverty to the middle class is the labor unions. And so this is another reason we've seen this widening of the gap between the very rich and the very poor, is that route is gone. There's only about 11% of people in the private sector who are unionized. And I would love to see the reunionization so that we were more like European nations, like Germany and other countries that have vigorous unions, as we used to have. And people who come here who are poor have an opportunity to get healthcare and pensions and some kind of job security, and not just work at jobs at minimum wage where they can be fired at any minute.
Right. Yeah, a recent study came out, I think last month, showing that, of course, going to college and beyond is important, but in fact, higher salaries are commensurate with union membership over higher ed, right? And none of us in unions find that shocking, right? So tossing it to Brian, it's C. Brian. I'm not sure if Brian's your first name, but jump right in, Brian.
Well, I'm gonna pass it off to Melissa first because she had her hand up first.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you. Good eyes. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, I'm a little surprised. I was not prepared. I'm lounging, listening, enjoying. Okay, cool. So this was coming to my mind when you were talking earlier, and I was trying to kind of formulate my thought. The people who've been wanting to dismantle education. So I'm like, not going to say Republicans only necessarily, because as you mentioned, like the plutocracy uses that sort of fake largesse to kind of distract from their wealth hoarding and their exploitation of workers. So it's like a lot of people pretending public education is their mission when it's really just like, they're just operating on vibes. So they've had this like really powerfully crafted narrative trying to frame public education as failing, even though like families all say they love their public schools. Families all say they love their child's education. So it's not really like families I feel like we need to get on board. It's the policymakers that seem most manipulated by this narrative and by the lobbyists and things like that. So like, how do we break through the anti-educator bias that like exists to the point where we are not even at the table when decisions about public education or education in general are being made, when action plans are being developed? There are no educators in those rooms making these choices. So like, what do we do to get to the policymakers to demonstrate that the educators and the practitioners are the experts in the field, not these randos with a vibe and money?
Right. Well, you're absolutely correct. And the policymakers, and I was just as critical of the Obama administration because I thought Common Core was horrible. I thought that Arne Duncan was a terrible Secretary of Education. And I thought that, George W. Bush's program was terrible. But you can take this all the way back to Clinton and the first Bush whom I worked for, which is they thought that they could steer the ship without knowing anything about ever sailing. And you have governors making decisions and congressmen. And one of the thoughts that I've entertained was they love testing so much. I would love to see every one of them take the 8th grade math test, the test that kids take. I mean, I am blown away. I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, and I would review the reading, and I would review the history, and I would review the civics. But then when I tried to review the math, I thought, good grief, I never learned this math when I was in school. I didn't learn it in 12th grade. And the 8th grade math is unbelievable. And I would like to see these guys who are saying that kids should take tests and be proficient, let them take the test. And if they can't pass the 8th grade test, they have to leave the legislature. That would be an unactionable proposal, but I like it. But I think, what you're describing is that the teachers should be at the table, and the only way you'll be at the table is one of two ways. One, run for office. And after the teacher strikes of 2019, there were teachers who ran for office and were elected. I can't remember, Tina Bojanowski in Kentucky was a special ed teacher who just got reelected for her second term. There was a teacher in Oklahoma who just got reelected. They will be in the room and they will be speaking for teachers. So that's one path. The other path is the unions, because when you have a strong union, you have someone who can go to the legislature and say, no, that's wrong. That's not going to work. We're not going to accept that teacher evaluation program because it's all based on test scores. And we've got all this evidence that teachers who have kids with special education or special needs, teachers who have a lot of poverty in their school will get lower test scores than teachers in wealthy suburbs. So this is a flawed method. Don't do this. But you've got to have someone at the table, and the someone is someone who represents you, which would be the union. And this is why the plutocrats, and you're quite right in calling them that, have been trying their best and doing very well at killing off the unions because they don't want you to have a voice. They
right.
don't care if you're certified or not certified, and they don't care. I mean, DeSantis, who's likely to be the next Republican candidate, he's bringing people in the classroom who are veterans, who have no background in teaching, community college graduates who have no background or training in teaching. And he'll talk about the Florida miracle. The miracle is that they hold kids back in third grade so they have good fourth grade scores. And then they skip
Right.
fourth grade and put them in fifth grade, and they have terrible eighth grade scores. So the miracle is a trick. And but you know, typical Florida. That all started with Jeb Bush.
Oh, right. Yeah. And then DeSantis said, hold my beer. And Alexa, I want to, I'm going back to Brian, but I just want to emphasize what Alexa said about, maybe we don't have time for this conversation right now, but I do want to say in terms of the unions and the racism in the unions, maybe that's another Zoom, but Alexa says another solution, important solution is more BIPOC teachers. And then Jean chimes in and says more BIPOC policymakers. 100% agree with that. Brian, you're up.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Just to plug myself for a second, I'm one of those teachers that left the classroom, and I just graduated from Georgetown School of Public Policy and looking for jobs in policy making. So if anybody knows one that I haven't applied for yet, let me know. Diane, my question is this, you know, speaking of standardized testing and also the learning loss craze right now, which there's not an educator in the country who didn't expect that there would be learning loss after the chaos of COVID. And yet they spent how many millions of dollars on testing, knowing kids are going to fail the test in the first place because they needed data. But my real question is, how do we change the rhetoric? Because in my opinion, what the NAEP scores and all test scores are showing is that after 2 years of COVID is that kids need teachers in classrooms who know what the heck they're talking about, know what they're doing. And they need to be in classrooms consistently, continuously, and so forth. And yet the rhetoric about learning loss is what do we do differently? But right now, you have these teacher shortages that are across the country. And so how do we change the rhetoric? How do we change the narrative in the press and elsewhere to make sure that we don't lose this window of opportunity, because we can kind of press that. You know, the reason why there's learning loss is because there's not enough teachers in the classrooms and kids haven't been in the classrooms long enough and consistent.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything you say. I mean, read my blog, I hope you will, because my reaction to the NAEP scores was, well, of course, there would be learning loss when kids have been out of school for, in some cases, a year, in some cases, 2 years. And remote learning has its uses, but to substitute that for human contact is not enough. You need to have a kid looking in the teacher's eyes and saying, did I do this right? And the teacher saying, let me show you, let me help you, let me show you how to do it better. You did a great job and you can do this and you can do that. Human contact, that desire that a child has to seek the approval of the teacher inspires the child to try harder, not the threat of punishment and not a low test score. So I think you're absolutely right. How do we change the narrative? The problem is the politicians. I think we're in a better position today with Biden as president because Jill Biden is Jill, his wife, is somebody who cares deeply about education and is a lifelong educator. And I think the Biden administration is the friendliest one we've had in a long time. I wish that he would follow through on a promise he made during the campaign to stop standardized testing. I watched a meeting in Pittsburgh where he said he would put an end to it. Part of the problem is that the politicians are wedded to the idea that if you don't have data, you don't know what's going on and you can't trust the teachers to make a judgment. And I'm old enough to have gone to school when we didn't have standardized tests, except for tests of things like, what are you likely to be someday in your lifetime? What are you going to grow up to be? So we'd have a standardized test to predict our professional or non-professional future, but we didn't have academic standardized tests because the teacher taught something and then the teacher tested what he or she taught. And the teacher made up the test and it reflected what was taught, which seems to me to make perfect sense. And the problem today, which has been going on since basically the 1980s, is that the people who become governor and the legislators don't trust teachers. They don't trust teachers to say that a child's making progress or that a child needs more of something or less of something. And they don't treat any other profession that way. So you're right, there's a tremendous job to be done in getting across that the experts are the professionals. And you wouldn't want to have just anybody off the street flying an airplane or doing surgery on you. Why would you want to have somebody just come in off the street or off the battlefield and become a teacher? There's one other point that I have to go back to, which is not responsive to your question, and that's about Josh Cowan. And Josh talked about what happened in Michigan, but what he didn't tell you was that he is right now one of the leading experts on the failure of vouchers. And he has written a number of articles. I hope that there are links to his articles that are available to you, because what he has shown with data is that going to a voucher school is equivalent to a Hurricane Katrina wiping out the schools of New Orleans, or to the pandemic, that there are kids in Ohio who had greater learning loss from going to voucher schools than was caused by the pandemic. That's pretty dramatic. The question is, how do we get that across? So I would say that the challenge here is to PBS, because the public doesn't understand what's happening in education. They don't understand that this whole movement of privatization, all these things are intertwined. And it took me a while to understand that the rhetoric about school failure is part of the rhetoric. It leads to privatization, because people say, if our schools are failing, let's let the businessmen take over. Let's let the governor take over. Let's let the mayor take over. And it's all a great lie and a great hoax. And several years ago, PBS had a program, I can't remember the name of the book, but the guy who wrote the book about why privatization was wonderful had a program on PBS, and I might think of his name any minute. But the program said, privatization is working in Chile, it's working in Sweden. For-profit schools are fantastic. The for-profit schools do a great job. And this was the thesis of his book. And when I saw the program, I realized it had been funded by right-wing foundations. And I raised a great stink, and I was interviewed on the local Channel 13. And I said, why would you put on a show that was funded by people who are partisan, who want to privatize schools? And this is not a fair program. Well, I think I've been banished since then. This program.
Well, no, I mean, I agree, and we're actually running out of time. So I agree that we do need to collectively push back. And those of us who don't feel comfortable about it because not in a union or in a state that's already attacking teachers for just teaching the truth, we do need to lift each other up and amplify each other's voices and pushing and really push back much stronger against this narrative, whether academics in the field are doing it or teachers in the trenches, which I hate using the term trenches, but who are in the classroom seeing it every day. That's why I'm so vocal about it, because I'm in a union, I'm protected, and I am fired up when I hear other teachers say they can't voice their opinions publicly, but want those messages out there. Because you're right, I hate doing this whole polarizing thing, but there is another side who really is dead set at destroying the public education system. Someone earlier on in the chat talked about how it's really integral to the great democracy that we're trying to keep building and keep alive in this country. So we do need to wrap. I want to thank everyone for all your thoughtful comments, whether you got to voice them tonight or in the chat. And of course, Diane, we could keep talking to you for 3 more hours, but it's going to get really late then. I just want to thank you for your time and for just gracing your presence and your incredible wisdom here tonight, and just being out there for us, fighting for us, and speaking truth to power, and maybe getting banned from one part of PBS, but you're always welcome on this side of PBS.
Well, truly, if there was one thing that I would love to see happen, it would be to have PBS devote an hour to the attack on public education. It has become such a national problem, and public education is a fundamental part of democracy. It teaches children who come from different backgrounds to live together, to learn together, to work together. And school choice, I think I have to say this, was born in the segregation movement of 1954. The Brown decision was followed by a push for school choice so that white kids didn't have to sit next to black kids. And we have to prepare kids to live in the society we have, not to live in the 19th century.
Yes. Amen to that. So Vicky already committed to pitch this, and we've just really, Vicky and I have been constantly trying to pitch more coverage on PBS and the media in general about the teacher's perspective. They like to talk a lot about us. They don't love talking to us. And we want to change that. And we really appreciate your efforts to get to voice our side of things.
You know, I'm very happy to be on this call. I would be happy to do it again. I think that teachers are the key to education. You really, you know, this bashing of teachers that's gone on for the last 10 or 15 years, and really it almost reached a high point or a low point with that film sponsored by Bill Gates and others, Waiting for Superman. A terrible movie, and it just led to, you know, this thing like the problem with education is teachers. Well, a lot of people got discouraged and quit teaching, and you can't have education without teachers. And you can't have, I mean, I don't believe in homeschooling, and I get a lot of negative feedback from homeschoolers who say that they're smarter than the teachers, but they're not. And just to have kids replicate what their parents know is not good enough. You got to learn more than your parents knew. So I'm a huge supporter and defender of people who go in the classroom. I think you're on the front lines, you're in the trenches, you're in probably one of the toughest professions and the worst paid professions in the world. But there's no more important profession today than teaching, because our society can't move forward if we're teaching kids only what their parents knew and teaching them the prejudices of their grandparents. And so I think there's a lot of fight ahead of us. And ultimately, I'm optimistic that we're not going to give our whole country away by basically saying we want to have a third-class education system made up of whatever people feel like doing, and that's education. I mean, there are states that literally have said that's what they want. And the woman running for governor in Arizona, who's only a half a point behind, wants to eliminate public education entirely and just say, here's the money to parents. They can do whatever they want to do. And she could be elected governor of Arizona. It's terrifying. She's a talk show host.
Terrifying. And I just want to say, Diane said it all, but I just want to say thank you, each and every one of you who's joined tonight, have been joining these for the past 3 years, 3 seasons of these. And you all give me so much hope. It's an honor to share this profession with you. And, you know, every single time we have these tough conversations about the state of our profession, I walk away feeling more hopeful, because every single one of you is so dedicated to this job, this profession, and most importantly to the young people that we're doing this for. And Diane is right. What we do every day, it's not a hyperbole to say that we are the protectors and supporters of our democracy. And I like to say, pushing further for a strong multiracial democracy, something that the people fighting our public education system are trying to stop from growing and developing. But I have faith that, just like Diane said, these movements wax and wane, and we're unfortunately in the waxing stage. But you know, I didn't take physics or whatever the system is behind waxing and waning. I just teach history, but I do hope we go into the waning cycle and just keep pushing, because we're doing this for our country and the young people. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for what you do every day for this country. And I want to thank Vicky and PBS NewsHour Classroom and Diane once again. And the fact that you said round 2 and we're recording this, we're going to hold you to it, Diane.
I'm glad. It's a pleasure. I love talking to teachers and I get renewed and it makes me energetic and want to keep fighting. And I hope everyone feels that way because we can't be passive. We have to vote. And even if we lose, we have to bounce back and do it again. But
Amen to
thank you, Sarah Beth, and thank you so much, Vicky. I appreciate your putting this together and thank you to everybody who participated.
Yay, thank you.